Indians are less than 1% of the US population, but 14% of patents in the US, right? So they're like on the innovation landscape, they're outliers, right? In the US, they said, okay, that's a lot of backend coding that we don't want to deal with. Let's send it to India. By the 2000s, 70% of these visas were going to people from India, and 86% of computer scientists coming into the US were coming from India, right? So it was like the Indians essentially took over that entire kind of that pathway, right? And it kind of took off because of the tech boom. China was creating scientists while India was creating engineers, right?
Hi everyone, in this episode I get to speak with Gaurav Khanna. Gaurav is an economist at UC San Diego School of Global Policy and Strategy, where he studies migration, labor and development. He's also a fellow at the Center for Global Development and an editor at the Journal of Labor Economics. In this episode, we discuss how US immigration policy accidentally built India's tech industry, why the engineers who didn't get the US visa mattered as much as the ones who did, and what the AI boom means for the next generation of Indian engineers. We talk about the IITs, Y2K, the H-1B lottery, why China pulled ahead, and why the brain drain story may be getting it backwards. I had a great time researching and recording this episode. I hope you guys like it, and I hope you guys find this useful. With that, Gaurav Khanna, my friends.
I wanted to understand before we get into the immigration stuff and before we get into H-1B and the brain gain, etc. If we go back to 1980s or late 1980s, one reason that seems apparent to me that people, IT engineers or computer professionals who wanted to move to the US, there seems to be a straightforward reason that, there's obviously better pay, which I think is true even today as well. I think Microsoft was offering about $40,000 US dollars for a programming job, whereas I think in India, it would be around $5,000, etc. So obviously there's a gap in salaries or wages that have been offered in the US as opposed to India. But what I'm more curious about is, why was there an IT industry or, a talent pool of IT professionals in India to begin with, right? Because what I'm thinking of is India at that point. India today is at $3,500 per capita income. In 1980s or 1990s, it would be even, I'm guessing, half that, right? So why was there a talent pool to begin with? And any thoughts on that? Why was the industry to begin with at all?
No, it's a great question, and the history really of kind of the high-tech sector in India is super interesting, right? So in the 80s, what's happening in the US is kind of like the hardware boom first, right? Like the IBM, the chips and all are coming up, the computers are getting smaller and smaller. This is before the internet has been decommissioned for commercial purposes, right? So it's still kind of, there is no really tech boom that's happened. Yeah, this is still the hardware boom that's happening in the US. And what happened at that time, the IITs actually played an important role. So India had some really good engineering colleges, right? So the IITs, even today, actually, they play an important role. But back then, there was nothing like that in emerging economies elsewhere, right? China had nothing like that in the same caliber of engineering colleges, for instance. East Asia couldn't compete in producing that kind of talent. And India also had kind of the English language, right? Which again made it very easy for the US, where the hardware boom was happening in the US, it made it easy for kind of these entrepreneurs in the US to work with workers from India. So what happened was they started sending some work to India. Then there were a lot of internal political battles in India. Actually, India then throughout IBM came to India. India threw out IBM saying, this American company that threw out Coca-Cola. It was at that time when they were we don't want these Americans. Then, of course, there's kind of a crisis that hits the country. And as part of kind of the recovery of the crisis, they try to re-attract part of kind of foreign investment back into the country, right? And one thing that they do is they set up these big satellite parks, essentially, outside some major cities in Bombay, including. They have these huge satellite dishes saying that, look, you send us the work and we'll do the work, right, in India, right? So that's kind of like the 1990s, right, the early 1990s. Then the internet gets kind of decommissioned, so for commercial purposes. So now we're thinking eBay, Yahoo, early Amazon really starts taking off, right? And more work starts getting kind of sent to India at that time, right? So that's the initial hardware boom where people realized that Indian engineers are really good, was an important kind of catalyst So that when the software boom started taking off, they knew that these Indians could really do that work, right? We know that these IIT grads can really handle it. And then Y2K is the other turning point, because what happens around 2000 is that, like the Y2K problem is arising and everyone's like, okay, we need.
Sorry. If you can set context on, because I think the Y2K problem, maybe, but before, I think we've gone far into the 1990s at this point. I'd like to take a step back here. Before, in the sense that one of the ways that I think one of the advantages of people working in Bangalore or people working in India is that there's a 12-hour gap between the US and between US and India, right? And there can be continuous amount of continuous work that can be parallelly done, but also continuously done. When the US engineers are asleep, Indian engineers can keep grinding at the problem. You can get more projects done that way. But again, this only happens, like you mentioned, once they bring in satellites or because of the internet, etc. But I think before that, I think even in the I think maybe 70s, 80s, TCS engineers used to fly out Indian engineers instead of writing the code and sending the code to the. They used to just ship people to US so that they could go on to the client. And I think this happens even today, but at a different scale and maybe at a lesser scale. Could you walk us through what that was about and why was that being done?
So there was a few different things, right? So you had people coming. So again, so in the 70s, who were the engineers going? There, of course, there were different booms happening in the US, aeronautical booms. So they were building airplanes and things like that. Like there were Indian engineers going there as well. But that also helped build some of the reputation as about Indian engineers, right? Those guys as well. So what the market strategy that TCS and all had was that, look, we are affordable, right? We are comfortable with the language, with the communication, and we can really kind of set up your systems. We understand this technology and we can help kind of set it up for you. And that's a technology where they're saying it's very customized, right? So your business or like your bank needs to set up something, this technology infrastructure, and we can come on site and set that up for you, right? And because we're going to be cheaper, we're going to be able to communicate with you, and we know this. Now to be fair, that was happening, but the scale was not very big, compared to what was coming later in the 1990s, right? And part of that was
You mean they were shipping more people in the 1990s? Is
yes,
that what you're saying? Or
many more people were coming in the 1990s and then in the 2000s as well, right? So, but the folks that came in the 80s were crucial for kind of reputational purposes. People were like, oh, these Indian engineers can really do it. So what happens in the 80s is there is no H-1B program. The H-1B program starts in the early 1990s, right? And so it makes kind of the migration pathways kind of much more standardized. And that's what allows like kind of a big wave of migration to start in some ways. This is all temporary migration, right? They're going for 3 years or so, right? But why, when the H-1B program started, why was it that they chose workers from India? Because of the folks who came in the 80s, right? The folks who came in the 80s, essentially, from the IITs and all. And so people in the 90s, once the H-1B program was starting, they said, okay, we want people from IIT, right? And that's when it started happening at a massive scale. The TCS, Infosys, Wipro, and all, they kind of really, Satyam, they kind of really kind of tapped into that infrastructure, saying that, okay, look, we'll be sending you these engineering grads at a much bigger scale, right? So the numbers were much higher in the 90s, partly because there was just no kind of immigration pathway of the same scale that existed in the 80s.
you spoke about reputation like multiple times, how the reputation of the Indian engineer got built over, the 80s, and obviously Y2Ks also feel like a major part to play. Is it fair that, and I also feel like you attribute a lot of that to the IIT grads. So is that fair? And if I can take one more step back, I mean, does that mean that the creation of the IITs itself was like a major reason why some of this reputation got built, because those engineers were not able to kind of, work in India because there were not enough jobs, and they, by accident created that reputation, etc. Is that fair? Or
Yeah, so I mean, it is much more complicated than that. See, so what are the IITs doing? So the IITs, are playing two roles, right? They're not just imparting education, but they are also selecting the top talent, right? And India is a big country, for a lot of these kinds of high level coding, you want like, some of the best talent, right? That means from a big country, you need people from the right tail of the distribution. In a big country, there's a lot of people in that right tail of that ability distribution, right? And the IITs kind of select them, right? So the reputation of the IIT also gets built on kind of as a selection mechanism, right? It's like a very competitive thing. You get in, and the guys who went in the 80s were from these IITs. And so they knew how to hire the next kind of generation of people coming out of the IITs. They told people, look, like we understand how to read these applications. We understand how to read kind of these transcripts and so on. We know can identify the talent for you, right? And so it is true that the IITs did play an important role in kind of that bridge. Even today, actually, there's some excellent research, not by me, by other economists, showing if you look at kind of on average, they basically look at all the universities in the world, right? And they look at on average, who are the kind of the highest paid people in a global labor market? It's actually on average people from the IITs. It's a great paper. I don't know if your podcast allows me to link to stuff, but like it's a great paper. But if you look at it, like the top universities on average will still be the IITs, right? And part of it is kind of the selection role that they play, and then part of it is kind of the education actually the teaching that they also do, the training that they do, right? And you're right that at that time, so in the 90s, what was happening also, there was this big increase in kind of enrollment in these tech degrees, these computer science degrees. But there were no tech jobs in India, really. There were a few, but like not at the scale that we were training, right? And so essentially what was happening was we were training them for the global labor market, right? A lot of people wanted to do these degrees with the prospect of migrating to the US, right? Where they would earn these salaries that were 8 times higher, 7 times higher than you would get in India, right?
So I think IITs as a separate section itself, I think we have a lot to cover, and I think we can touch on that. But if I can take another step back, you spoke about H-1B, coming in the early 90s. One is I think at this point we've been speaking primarily about migration related to computer science field. Could you paint a picture on what was is it fair to say that even before H-1B, was the migration pattern the same that, mostly CS graduates used to migrate from, let's say, from India to the US for mostly tech jobs, or was there a different pattern? And also, if you can also set the stage, what is H-1B in itself, and
Yeah, that's a great question. So you would get engineers going to the US, but not necessarily CS grads at that time. So there were engineers of all types, mechanical, electronic. They were helping build like the airline industry. They were helping build other kind of hardware industries, right? And then you would also get doctors at that time, right? But all of that was dwarfed in scale by what was to come in the 1990s, which was just, computer science grads, right? If you compare the numbers, that was kind of an order of magnitude higher of, you had computer science grads in the 1990s going compared to kind of the numbers you were seeing with engineers and doctors in the 80s, right? And they were going to the US. So the migration, for instance, to the UK was mostly actually physicians, doctors, right? There was no tech folks were not going to the UK, right? So if you look at kind of by country, so what was the H-1B program? The H-1B program is for high-skilled workers in what they call specialty occupations, right? So there's a list of occupations that the US classifies as specialty occupations. These are occupations that they think will be good for the US in terms of growth, and that they claim there's not enough local talent being produced in these occupations, right? So software engineering, software development, and computer programming were kind of part of this list of specialty occupations. There were, of course, many other specialty occupations, including aeronautical engineers and so on and so forth, right? And it's a visa, it's a high school visa. You have to have a college degree in the relevant field and so on. It's a visa, it's a temporary visa, right? So it's basically, 3 years, renewal for another 3 years, so 6 years. And then you have to get a green card if you want to stay. You have to become a permanent resident if you want to stay further. But the green card process for Indians is backlogged. So the green cards have country quotas, which means India is kind of oversubscribed for that. And so Indians have to wait a very long time to get a green card, right? So the H-1B was like a temporary visa, essentially. And after 6 years, a lot of folks actually went back to India also at that time. Yeah. So,
You mentioned that like previously there may be physicians, doctors who would migrate from India to the US, UK, etc. And 90s, you seem to ascribe 90s there was like an exponential change or a major change in CS graduates going to the US. Is that boom mostly ascribed to the internet boom and the requirement of? I'm
yeah,
guessing internet
absolutely.
boom was the major driver for that and the
Absolutely.
money getting
Yeah.
made. Okay.
So yeah, exactly. So what happens is, you decommission the net for commercial purposes, and then you have the Yahoos, eBays, Amazon that really takes off. And suddenly Silicon Valley is like, we need these computer science grads. We can't produce them locally, so at the scale that we need them, right? A lot of the American students were getting MBAs rather than engineering degrees or getting law degrees and so on, right? Like a lot of their top talent. So where do we get them from? Well, we know these the hardware people who came from India were really great. That's a market we can tap into. So they really took over the entire kind of H-1B pathway. By the 2000s, 70% of these visas were going to people from India, and 86% of computer scientists coming into the US were coming from India, right? So it was like the Indians essentially took over that entire kind of that pathway, right? And it kind of took off because of the tech boom.
So I see two threads forming here, right? So one is because of the internet boom, there are people migrating from India to the US and maybe, getting jobs in the US and then, building like a community in the US itself. But also how there are a bunch of engineers sitting in India, but apparently there are a bunch of engineers sitting in India and working for the US companies, either because, and, this might be also like you touched on how either due to they didn't get the visa to continue staying in India, so they come back and either they start some outsourcing operation or they continue working in. So there seems to continue working in Bangalore and building that. So I feel like those two are these two things related as well, like
Absolutely. So exactly. So I think it's a very important point because people keep talking about this brain drain that's happening from India, right? Like they're going, but what they don't see the flip side of that that's very related is the kind of brain gain this entire process created. And what do I mean by that? So kind of the prospect of migrating to the US and getting this salary that was kind of 8 times higher is what really drove the big enrollment in computer science and engineering degrees in India, right, in the 1990s. So there was this big increase in kids getting these degrees. All our uncles and teachers, like my teachers were always like, hey, get an engineering degree. I disappointed that I was the black sheep of that classroom because I was the only one who didn't get an engineering degree, right? And they were all saying, get this engineering degree because you can get this amazing job in Silicon Valley that can pay you 8 times as much, right? But of course, the H-1B visa is capped, right? So that not all these, students who are getting this engineering degree can get a job in the US. So out of the kind of the 10 new students who are getting these degrees, only one of them goes to the US, earns a very high salary. But the other 9 students are now there in India, right? So there's a skilled workforce in India, right? And then what happens is when the H1, the people who did go abroad to the US, after 6 years, a bunch of their visas expire and some of them come back, right? So that's what we call brain circulation. They come back bringing ideas, they come back bringing networks with Silicon Valley. So in the long run, what happens is there is this tech workforce in India that includes the students who kind of got these skills with the prospect of migrating but didn't get the visa, and it includes the return migrants, right? So there's this tech workforce in India, and that's kind of the brain gain because then the tech firms tap into this workforce in India, and then the Indian tech boom takes off, right? So in the 2000s, the Indian tech boom really kind of takes off. By 2005, India becomes the largest exporter of IT products. So this is something, the US had dominated the tech export scene, and then 2005, India overtakes them. And what's happening is the tech boom has spread from the US to India. The US has started sending the work to India, and that work essentially just gets exported back to the US, right? So it shows up as kind of driving production in India and export-led growth in India, right? So it's a spread of the tech boom because of US migration policy, essentially, right? From halfway around the world, right? And this brain gain is kind of, in some ways, what we show in our work kind of really outweighs kind of the brain drain kind of narrative that is going on.
You mentioned that India ultimately becomes like the leading exporter of software services. What does that mean? I mean, you paint a picture on what that essentially, like, what are we exporting? Like, I mean, just to set some context around this question, right? Like, I mean, I was talking to my uncle the other day, and he was asking me, like, what do you do? I couldn't really explain. Like, I mean, you can't really tell, you're doing some recommendation engine, etc. So, because for things like if you're manufacturing, let's say, a shirt, etc., the outcome or the output is tangible, and you can easily what is like that you're exporting. But like, if you can give us a picture on what are Indians actually exporting to the world?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So it includes all kinds of stuff. So some things that people are very familiar with related to kind of business process outsourcing, right? Like, so that's like, a lot of the call center stuff that people, that's more tangible. You call up in the US, anytime I have a problem and I make a phone call, I have a problem with the internet at home, I call my internet provider, it's someone in India that's helping me out. Or I call the airline, there's someone in India that's helping me out, right? But that's kind of something that people are familiar with. What's more hard to explain is the fact that a lot of organizations will just need simple things done for their, so for I teach at a university, right? We need to create for our university a system where we can upload all our lectures and grade the students' stuff and kind of keep track of who's attending class and so on. And so we need a much more customized software, right, for that, right? What can happen? You can get someone from TCS to show up on site to my university here, set up that system. That person, that TCS person, essentially who comes in person, will be like speaking to the university administrators to kind of understand what they really need. But he doesn't sit here and do the coding. He sends the code, all the software development to his office in India. So in India, they then set up the entire infrastructure. Then they send it back. The TCS guy shows the university administrators how to use the system. They say, oh, actually, we want to tweak it this way. We want the students to be able to see their grades the moment it's uploaded. Then he sends those messages back to India. They change it. So you're exporting kind of all these kind of software services, right? But the immigrant who came on the H-1B visa, who's working for TCS, also plays an important role there, right, in sending some of that work back, right? And then there is, of course, the other kind of work, which is Google will just set up an office in India, right? Or, US kind of startups will set up offices in India where they will say, okay, we are kind of, they will do all the new product development in Silicon Valley, but we need a bunch of code to be written for this, here. So they'll give you fixed instructions. Like, so we need you to write this code for this application we're building. So it won't actually be innovation that's happening in India, but the coding task has kind of been sent to India, right? And that then gets exported back to the US, right? So all of that is kind of shows up as IT exports, essentially.
The nature of jobs that have been outsourced or the tasks that have been outsourced changed at all? Like, guessing, like, part of me obviously is like, sure. I mean, again, my guess is that initially, maybe, like you mentioned, call center work was being outsourced. And I'm guessing as and when they understand that, the capability of Indian engineers in Bangalore or Hyderabad is to the par of Silicon Valley engineer, they either outsource more work like product development. Is that fair, or am I missing some linkages here?
Yeah, I think it's definitely changed in the sense that they've been getting more and more confident and comfortable with kind of sending the work to India, which means they just kind of, what that means is they send more and more high level work, right? The other thing is like so there's this new phenomenon, these global capability centers. I don't know if you've been following these GCCs, right? So they've been kind of setting up GCCs in India where you'll have the companies coming, and then essentially it's a way for technology transfer to also occur in some way. They say that, okay, we are bringing kind of this technology, we'll bring some of our workers from the US as well, and we'll hire a lot of the workers here in India, and we'll do a lot of high level product development in India in that case, right? So the nature of work has really changed a lot, I think. And I think the big inflection point there was actually Y2K, because with Y2K, they had sent a lot of the low level coding, and then they said, oh, like these guys did it so well. They sent all the low level coding to fix all the Y2K. And they were like, oh, Indians did a great job. And
really sorry.
Yeah.
I'm really sorry, Gaurav. If you can maybe talk us to, like, let us know what is the Y2K problem, and and how accidentally maybe help India?
Yeah. So basically, what happened is, like the computing systems that were set up, right, had a lot of kind of code written in a way that was in some ways probably not as forward looking. That at the change of the millennium, all the dates would change, right? And so you needed to essentially go in and change a lot of kind of these back end codes, right? Now, you're not coming up with a new product. You're not coming up with a new type of word processor or game or something like that. You're literally your existing product. I need to change some amount of the backend code because when the millennium hits and all the dates change, then the software is essentially non-functional, is what the fear was, right? So they said, okay, in the US, they said, okay, that's a lot of backend coding that we don't want to deal with. Let's send it to India. So India did a lot of that work, right? And we did a really good job of it, right? I mean, people didn't really notice the Y2K, was really not that much of a kind of effect on stuff, right? And after that, they started sending more and more work, right? Like that kind of really helped build the reputation for kind of offshoring, because before that they had gotten the migrants to the US, but there was this notion that those migrants have to be in Silicon Valley for them to be coders. But with the Y2K stuff, they sent stuff to India, and they said, oh wait, we can send more and more work to India, right? So that really helped kind of send kind of more high level stuff as well down the road.
So if I can take a tangent here, I'm not sure if you want to, some sort of speculation, I guess, which is there are two threads here, right? So one is the thread that India ultimately becomes like the largest exporter of software services in the world. Also, earlier we touched on the thread about how Indian engineers, particularly the IT engineers, are globally reputed and known to be pretty strong engineers themselves. Yet India has not been able to, again, coming to today, India has not been able to produce a lot of globally relevant technology companies. Any thoughts on why that could be? Like those two things
Yeah.
could be true.
I think that's a fantastic question, because India clearly has the talent, right? Like you see the tech workers in Silicon Valley, they're from India, right? The CEO of the top company, the Sundar Pichai, the Satya Nadellas, the Shantanu, the Adobe guys, the IBM CEO, the Palo Alto Network CEO, they're all Indians, right? Like they're all like, they're clearly not just coders, innovators, they're doing a lot of the patenting. So like, for instance, Indians are less than 1% of the US population, but 14% of patents in the US, right? So they're like on the innovation landscape, they're outliers, right? So why is it that they're not doing this in India, right? And essentially the big hypothesis here is that institutions are just very different, right? There's something special about being in Silicon Valley, right? And that's part of it is the risk capital that exists there. So the deep kind of the US has deep financial markets, not like India is trying to fix it, the changing bankruptcy laws, but the US has deep financial markets. What venture capitalists in the US do is they bet on hundreds of companies, right? 90% of them fail. One of them becomes a unicorn. It covers all your other bets, right? So that kind of ecosystem allows kind of a lot of kind of innovation, a lot of startup growth, and so on and so forth, right? It has that. It manages to attract the best talent from around the world, right? And there's a kind of an exchange of ideas that happens. There's a full infrastructure built. There's a customer base that's been built. People know when I want new products, where should I go? I should go to Silicon Valley and so on and so forth. So people keep talking about, oh, Silicon Valley is dying. But then when you have the AI boom, where is it going to be? It's in Silicon Valley. It's like every boom you get ends up being in Silicon Valley. There's something special about being there, right? In India, you have the institutional roadblocks in some ways that prevent that same talent, the same kind of, you don't have Sundar Pichai and Satya Nadella in India creating, and part of it is related to a lot of these institutional roadblocks. The risk capital is trying. I think there's a lot of great VCs, but they're fighting against kind of a lot of the setup that kind of doesn't really exist, right? So I think that's kind of the frustration in some ways, right? Like India clearly has the talent. They're really good at doing a lot of this coding, a lot of the innovation. They're hardworking, right? Some of the most hardworking kind of tech workers you see, but the startups are kind of fighting institutional roadblocks that prevent them from growing and becoming kind of relevant in that way, I think. So
Continuing on the speculation, but at least maybe slightly off topic, maybe, which is I think since the 90s, US seems to be, at least my understanding is that US seems to be like the most desired place for Indians to emigrate, even if it's not the most desired. At least if I'm not wrong, I think the highest number of migrants, I think, might be in the US. My understanding is I think there are about 3 million people in the US who are Indian American.
yeah,
I'm guessing the UK number is less than a million. And I think maybe close to a million in the Middle East, like
yeah,
cumulatively. I'm guessing that's true.
yeah.
Any is that mostly because of the wage differential? Like, I mean, people incentives are because US ends up paying like the most amount of money. Maybe major reason, or any other thoughts there?
Yeah, I think part of it is the tech sector, right? The US is a big country, of course, right? Like also, right? Like let's not, population-wise, it's just a big country, but the tech sector, the numbers we were seeing with the H-1B program and the tech boom, what was what really made the US an outlier in some ways, right? So before that, the UK, Canada, like there were people from India there. But then it was kind of the tech workers that were kind of make the US an outlier. But even if you take out all the tech workers, for instance, there's like 75,000 Indian doctors in the US right now that, and these are like non-citizens. So newly arrived kind of, 75,000. And that's a pretty important, they play an important role in kind of primary healthcare in rural areas in the US. So like so there's like, they're playing very important roles in other sectors as well, high skilled sectors, right? For instance, right? So yes, the US is the top destination, mostly because of the wages are way higher in the US than in other countries, right? And especially the tech sector wages, which are kind of, really out there. But even physicians in the US get paid very well. So after that, you have the tech sector workers, you'll have the physicians, then you'll have the research scientists, you'll have the university professors. Those are kind of where you'll see a lot of the Indian diaspora really showing up.
Final tangent, and then we'll come to a topic, which is, earlier we spoke on the thread about because the 90s internet boom, we saw a lot of migration from Indians to the US. Do you have any thoughts on, are we seeing a similar migration boom due to the AI mania, if I may say that, been happening, over the past 3-4 years?
Yeah. So the AI thing is actually complicating things, I think, a lot for a few different reasons, right? So there is a demand for certain types of talent, right? But AI is also kind of labor replacing technology in some ways. So what were the three kind of things that made Indian workers attractive? They could code really well, they are comfortable with the language, and they are very affordable, right? Now, AI kind of beats these entry level workers at each of these three, right? AI can code better in some ways for certain tasks. Language is never an issue, and it's getting cheaper and cheaper, right? So in some ways, I think it's going to change, the demand for a certain type of entry level programmers from India. But it might shift the demand to kind of other kinds of AI research, AI scientists essentially, right? So people who can develop AI products, right? So if you look the Forbes in the US is the Forbes magazine, that it has the top 50 AI startups in the US, right? Out of the top 50 AI startups in the US, 10 are founded by Indians, right? So Indians are now playing this important role. They're either founded or co-founded by Indians, right? So they're playing this important role. They're trying to pivot in the US to kind of be a part of this new AI boom, right? And again, it just shows kind of the talent that there is in India, right? Now, on the Indian side, unfortunately, I think India is falling behind really on the AI side, and that in the long run is going to mean that you kind of give away this advantage that of the kind of talent that's being created, and so then you won't be able to kind of participate in the same kind of global market that requires this talent really. Yeah.
I want to switch gears a little bit here.
Yeah.
So I think till now we have been speaking mostly about one is on the engineering front, second is the IT boom, internet boom, software. Even when we spoke about Indians migrating from, it was mostly for tech jobs. Can we paint a picture? I think most people when they migrate, uh, most people when they migrate in general, they think about either getting a UG degree or a master's degree, and that seems to be the pathway to kind of getting. That seems to be like the pathway to getting a job in the US, but also, if all things work out well, staying in the US in the long run. Could you paint a picture of what the education landscape looks like for migrants? Generally, how do they think about it when they're migrating? What are the kind of factors they look at, and what is the landscape? How does it even benefit? How does it benefit the American universities as well? Right?
Yeah.
What's
Yeah,
that
that's
picture?
a great question. That's a great question. So Indian students today are the largest source of international students in the US, right? So after, so the Chinese students were the largest source still about COVID. And then after COVID, the Indian students kind of are the largest source. So, and they play a really important role in the US higher education sector. So firstly, they're a source of revenue in some ways. The US higher education sector has been losing a lot of money from the government, and they also need kind of revenue from international students because local students pay a very subsidized tuition, right? But international students pay for full tuition, so they're an important source of the revenue, and that's kind of been an important part. But the real thing is that they are also researchers in the labs. They are teaching assistants, and so they're part of the labor force of the university in some ways that produces new knowledge. So if you see, they're involved in a lot of publication, a lot of patenting that the university is doing, coming up, developing new products. All of that starts at the university level itself, right? But you're totally right that the higher education sector in the US is a stepping stone into the US labor market, right? And the H-1B visa is capped, but student visas are not capped. So a lot of folks first come to the US on a student visa, right? And then there's an easier pathway into the US labor market because US universities recruit, US companies recruit from US universities, and there's a separate worker visa allocation for graduates of US universities. So the H-1B lottery becomes less competitive if you have a US degree, for instance, right? So suddenly it's like a very attractive pathway, and the US has benefited from this a lot because it's been a pipeline for that talent, right? So MIT and these colleges will select the best students, and then they'll graduate and become a part of the US tech sector. So the US tech sector has kind of then benefited from the selection process that the US universities had essentially done for them, right? And kind of recruited this talent to come to the US and then become a part of the US ecosystem, right? But one big reason why Indian students come to the US is the prospect of joining the US labor market. So every time there's a recession in the US, you actually see Indian enrollment at US universities go down. Why should Indian students care about a recession in the US? Well, they're not going to get a job that easily if they graduate from a US university. So then why come to the US in the first place, right? Or if there's a tightening of worker visa rules, student visas also go down because why do they want to come if they don't get a job? So one of the main reasons they're coming is to get that job in the US labor market, right? So if you look at in our data, we see how many students stay on. More than 80 to 90% at least do some work after graduating from the US. Whereas for Chinese students, a lot of them go back to China, right? Like only about 60% might do some work in the US or even less than that, but a lot of them actually return back to China.
Could I ask you why that is? Because my understanding would be like, I mean, obviously China is not much richer than India. It's richer definitely than India, but any reason? Do you have any thoughts on why would the
China
Chinese?
is it's 5 times at least as richer than India. So that is actually it is much richer than India. But some of the reasons is that look, the Chinese students don't have the same command of the English language, so the navigating the U.S. labor market is a bit more challenging for them. But they actually do get return to a U.S. degree in China can be quite high. China essentially what they do is they make a big effort to attract those students back to China. They essentially say, come back to China, we'll place you in these top firms, we'll give you, if you want to be a professor, we'll give you a top university job, we'll help you set up the next AI company that you want to set up in China, solar cell company, EV company, whatever it is, like we want to attract you back. They make an effort to do stuff like that. So you have a lot of the Chinese students go back because at least in the 2000s, there was this kind of thriving boom essentially that was happening in China, right? So. Yeah.
And for the students that come in, I mean, that the students that come in and study, I mean, essentially the way I'm looking at it is, even though you did mention that, H-1B is a lottery, ultimately it seems like they are buying a lottery ticket, right? When they make when they get into the system, or when they get an admission into a university, they are essentially playing the lottery. If they are, if their ultimate goal is to work in the US, they are playing a lottery. Is the gamble worth it for the people who don't make it?
It's a great question. So, I mean, with lottery tickets, of course, the person who loses the lottery is unhappy, right? Because you paid money for a lottery ticket and then you lost the lottery, right? But the question is, are the skills that you invested in with the hope of getting that US job, are those skills valuable even if you don't get that US job? Right? So the question is, I went and got a degree in computer science with the prospect of getting a US job. Now, I didn't get the US job. I lost the H-1B lottery. Are my computer science skills still valuable elsewhere? Right? Now, they're not as valuable as they would have been in Silicon Valley, right? In Silicon Valley, they're extremely valuable, like those skills. In other parts of the world, they are somewhat valuable, but nothing like what it would be in Silicon Valley, right? So you do get for a lot of people, they should have, someone who say would have been a really good doctor, but did a computer science degree only because he was hoping to win the H-1B lottery and lost the lottery. That's too bad because we lost a pretty good doctor. You know what I mean? Like it can not be great, but that's kind of how the world works, right? Like, growing up, for instance, I did all this cricket coaching, right? I grew up in Calcutta, like everyone around me was doing cricket coaching. Why? Like, you saw cricketers every day on TV. You had this dream, I'm going to be the next like Sachin, and everyone did cricket coaching, right? But none of us became cricketers. None of my friends are cricketers, at least. Like, all of us did all this, but that aspiration is there, right? Because of that aspiration, you invest in that skill, you try, and then you're like, okay, I don't have it, So yeah.
So going back to the universities, right? So before, again, we started off with H1B, but I think that comes very later in the pipeline. So I think you mentioned that, students, when they come to universities, they come with a student visa. My understanding of that is that's an F1 visa.
Yeah.
Let's assume that, now they've graduated. What happens next? I mean, it's STEM and non-STEM fields. Like, what's the next mission?
Yeah. So the good thing, so in the US, if you have a STEM degree, then even on your F1 visa, you can work, for now up to 3 years, right? So even if you don't get the H-1B, so what happens is every year those students will enter the H-1B lottery, right? So essentially they'll do it for at least a few, they'll try while they're in the US, so they're still working on the F1 visa, and they could be working for Microsoft, they could be working for Google, they could be working for a startup, whatever it is on that F1 visa, right? You can continue to work if you have a STEM degree. If you don't have a STEM degree, you can still work for 1 year, right? But the important thing about the H-1B lottery is that there is a separate quota for those people who have a US graduate degree, right? So you have a master's degree in computer science from, say, University of Arizona or whatever, you're in a separate quota, which means your chances of winning the H-1B lottery are a lot higher than someone who only got educated in India, right? So that's another reason why it's attractive to get a US degree, because then it becomes, at least the probability of winning that lottery increases essentially.
And just to be clear, is my understanding is this applicable only to the master's degree, right? Or is it even to the
graduate? Yeah, what they call graduate degrees in the US. So masters or PhD or any like masters related. Yeah, exactly. So those are in the US they call them graduate degrees. Yeah.
Understood. What happens to, so we have just spoken about this in terms of the Indian context and, on the Indian students, on the Indian citizens, etc. What is the impact of this on the American students, etc.? What I mean is, let's say there is a PhD advisor and, he can advise at the max, maybe some, 10, 15 students. Again, I'm throwing this number off the top of my head. So is there any impact on migration for the US students per se? Positive mix.
It's a great question. So in our research, what we find is that actually the revenue that the Indian students bring is what allowed these universities in the US to actually expand and enroll more local students and keep the local tuition rates low. So what they call in-state student tuition rates stayed low. And then the revenue that the Indian students were bringing was then spent on essentially what we call cross-subsidizing the local student. That means you take the revenue from the Indian student and it pays for the education of the American student, right? So it allows you to enroll more American students. And what then they spent that money also on was kind of more instruction, expenditures, more research labs, and so on and so forth. What you see is universities expanded their engineering departments, for instance, right? Now, that can be controversial in the US. There are schools, there are especially certain state schools like Michigan State Schools, which kind of expanded their engineering departments, but kind of contracted their history department and English literature department and stuff like that, because again, they were getting all this revenue, the engineering department was getting all this revenue from Indian students, right? So yes, there is a trade-off in the sense that it shifts kind of what these universities are, what kind of departments they're focusing on. But on net, it's really benefiting the US students because of this cross subsidization. The revenue pays for the local students. It allows the university to spend more on infrastructure, quality, research labs. And then the Indian graduate students become the lab assistants, they become the teaching assistants, and so on and so forth, right? So kind of the entire production changes in that way. So, yeah.
So where are we today? Like in a sense that how have things in terms of Indian migration to the US, how has that changed? One factor is obviously Trump. Trump has been very how to put this. Trump has strong views on immigration, and a lot of people, at least again, I don't know how much this might be relevant, but I know a few acquaintances of mine who have changed their mind to go to the US because the situation becomes uncertain, right? Because if he either caps the H-1B to a loan or etc., that might impact their economic future. So I know a few people who have decided to maybe go to Canada or Australia, etc., and are looking into different countries. So what is the impact of the politics that is currently at play in the US impacting, let's say, Indian migration to the US?
That's a great question. Yeah, so I think it's had a pretty big impact actually, and the place it's had the biggest impact is the international students. So if you look at Indian enrollment at US universities, that's plummeted over the last year. And because the Indian students are essentially saying that there's this uncertainty, right? Like, why should I come to the US, spend so much money for a degree, if after I graduate, there's like no chance I'm going to get a job because the administration has these policies to clamp down on immigrants and, on the H-1B program and so forth, right? So Indian student enrollment has fallen. Now, H-1B visas granted has not fallen at all. So what that means is, and part of the reason that was that the cap was always binding in the sense that there were so many people applying for the H-1B, right? But there was, the cap was so low that it always was hit, right? So even if overall demand falls, as long as it's above the cap, right, you'll still have the same number of H-1Bs coming, right? So the number of H-1Bs showing up in the US is still the same as before, but the number of international students has fallen a lot, right? So that pipeline has kind of really changed. And part of the reason is that the administration in the US has, a lot of it is just the rhetoric, right? They're not even changing major policies, but they're just, the way they're talking about it makes it sound like they're going to change the policies in a way that will hurt immigrants. So then they're like, oh, we don't want to come. Why should I risk coming, starting a family when like 3 years from now I'll have to leave the country and so on and so forth, right? So yes, Canada capitalizes on that, right? So Canada then says, okay, well, come to Canada instead, and Europe is trying to capitalize. Germany is trying to say stuff like that. France is trying to say stuff like that. Now, the problem is each of these other countries are also having their own political debates, right? Like, so their opposition party will say, oh, we have too many immigrants as well, right? Like, so we need to do something. So there's uncertainty everywhere, right? Like the Trump one is very vocal, it's very salient. But if you kind of really read between the lines and what's happening in the UK, what's happening in Canada, what's happening in Australia, you have politicians there also saying we have too many Indian immigrants. We don't want them, So it is complicated, right? Like you might not get them going to these other countries as much, right? So you might have a lot of the talent staying back in India in these global capability centers where the US can now send a lot more work to India, So India is now more mature of a tech sector than it had in the early 1990s, right? It was so small in the 1990s. Now it's much bigger. So there are certain jobs in India, but unfortunately, it's still not Silicon Valley. It's still not going to be the kind of job that you can get in the US.
I mean, on Trump, I mean, funnily enough, that I think my understanding is that before he actually became the president in 24, not too
Yeah.
sure. He did go, yeah, the last election. He did during his campaigning. I think my understanding was that he was talking about giving every graduate a green card on spot. Like, I mean, that was I think the campaign promise that he made, which got a lot of people, at least on the I don't know, at least on the tech people in tech.
Yeah.
I think it got them a little excited, only to the disappointment once he actually became the president. Finally, I want to like my understanding is that the not only again this is not only for Indians in the US but also in general. I feel immigrants, even the Chinese Americans, etc., have done really well, and they have contributed a lot to the US economy. Like going back to your Forbes of the top startups, many of them are co-founded, if not by Indians, but by many of them are done by immigrants.
Yeah.
Like I would assume that because it's worked out so well for the US, I would assume that they would, double the cap of the H-1B or double the cap of immigrants that they let in, etc., even if it's only at the high skill level. But that has not been the case. That's to my understanding. Is the reason that, that it may that the local population, I mean, the American citizenry may not be very happy that immigrants are coming in and might take the jobs that, if not for the immigrants, they would go to the US. And that's a fair argument, right? Like, I mean, if the job is in America and if the American citizenry is not getting the job, then obviously it's fair that. But is that the major reason, or am I missing something?
That's a great question. So two things, right? So first, I totally agree that Trump is actually, I don't think, anti H-1B, right? And the Trump faction consists of kind of there's the tech sector is involved with on the Trump side, and they are pro H-1B still, right? Then there's the MAGA wing, right, which is very anti all kinds of immigration, right? And in some ways, they are now in charge of immigration policy. At least they were put in charge of immigration policy, essentially, right? And so that's where a lot of the messaging is coming from. I totally agree with you on. So clearly, in many ways, the benefits of immigrants are great for the U.S. economy. Like, the top AI startups, the patenting I talked about, like Indians are 1% of the U.S. population, 14% of patents are filed, like, so if you just think of the innovation that they're doing, that's great. But the problem is that a lot of the stuff, a lot of the benefits that immigrants bring are not that salient in the sense that, so what are the biggest benefits, right? The biggest benefits are like, our computers are faster, our phones are faster, our technology is better, right? It's hard to say, it's hard to know why that is, right? It's hard to say that, oh, this IIT grad came to Silicon Valley, developed a new kind of thing that then made my computer faster, so it allows me to do better stuff for my work, right? That's hard to put a salient kind of, saying that this IIT grad is the reason that happened, right? The other kind of gain is what we call downstream gain. So, software that these Indian immigrants are developing in Silicon Valley gets used in other sectors of the US economy. It's in the car manufacturing sector. The EV sector is using a lot of software. The banking sector, the financial sector uses all of the software that Indian immigrants are developing in Silicon Valley, right? So it raises the productivity of the car manufacturing sector. Our cars are better, our banking sector is more efficient, and so on, right? Again, it's not very salient. It's not something that a person who goes to a bank will be able to say, oh, it's because of an Indian immigrant in Silicon Valley, right?
Can I push back on that?
What is salient? But what is salient is tech workers, American tech workers saying, oh, I'm struggling to find a job. That's really salient, right? And then they say, oh, let's blame the Indian immigrant, right? So, yeah, sorry. I cut you off.
No, I wanted to push back on that in the sense
Yeah.
I agree with that, but also I also feel like there are a lot of, I mean, people like Sundar Pichai, Satya Nadella,
Yeah.
I think Shantanu, and
Yeah, they're out there. They're in the news.
dozens of Indians. They are all generally they are in the media, right? So I'm guessing. I mean,
yeah, Nikesh Arora, like these guys, yeah, they're out there. Yeah.
so like I would assume that there are a lot of US citizens looking at that. Oh wow, I mean, these guys are doing pretty well, and they are. I mean, they are
Yeah, but
definitely
the
not.
US citizen is looking at that and say, oh, why isn't an American doing that job?
Okay.
They're not saying that my life is easier because of something that they did. Like they're saying, why isn't an American? Why didn't Google make an American the CEO? And so and of course, part of it is, and this is true of immigration anywhere in the world, there's a little bit of, I have a way of life. I used to go down to the pub after work, and now that pub has become an Indian restaurant. Like, what's going on? Like, my way of life is changing. I see a lot of Indians in my community. Like, it's too many. I have too many Indian neighbors. Like, there's this kind of there's this the celebrating Diwali on the streets. What's going on here? There's kind of like this thing of, is my culture under threat, right? And so people might not like that. I mean, and Indians sometimes feel the same way when the other people from other communities come to their cities. There's like Indian internal migration is controversial, right? So it's the same kind of issue that that people feel like I have a way of life, it's under threat, right? And I think there's this kind of visceral backlash against immigrants for that reason, even though the economic gains are huge, right? And so, yeah.
So at this point, Gaurav, thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it. But if you have, I want to ask you 2 to 3, maybe 1 or 2 questions more on the IITs, if you have maybe 5 minutes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because, so again, I'm not prepared too much on the IITs, but if I can, so one thing is on the top of my head. One thing is the IITs were created by Nehru as I think the modern temples of India, if I'm not wrong. And I think the motivation or the thought was that India is going to be like a manufacturing powerhouse, and we'll need like high skilled labor in India. But essentially, ultimately, what's happened is that what ended up happening was it became the largest exporter of talent from India. So is that, I mean, the was the accident by Nehru a result of all this, some of the innovation that's happened, not only in India, but also in the US itself? And maybe your general take on IITs as well.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. So yes, they became exporters of talent, but like I said, that brain drain is what really created the brain gain. If we couldn't export that talent, if we couldn't tell people, hey, get an engineering degree because you'll get a job, that there's a chance that you'll get a job that pays you 800% more than it does in India, right? If you couldn't tell people that, if you couldn't do that, tell them about the math about how exporting talent really might benefit them, then you wouldn't get so many smart kids getting engineering degrees, right? And so you created the entire cohort of top engineers in India, and a lot of them stayed back in India because they couldn't get that job, right? And so there is an accidental kind of industrial policy in some ways that occurred because of the kind of the exporting of talent that the IITs were doing, right? And as a result of that, a lot more engineering colleges were started. The government started investing in kind of the next tier, all these national institutes of importance and so on and so forth, like trying to upgrade them to be of similar levels, right? And some of them are good, right? But then after a while, the quality starts deteriorating, right, in the higher education sector, right? A lot of private colleges entered, and a lot of them were degree mills, and they were like really low quality. They were not kind of, producing the kind of, the simple skills, that the Indian tech sector really needed. They were not really kind of being able to produce that, right? So it did lead to a boom in kind of the engineering colleges. The many more engineering colleges were born in India. And some of them were not bad, but a lot of them were not great, right? And so you kind of get this dispersion of quality that also occurs, right? But at the same time, what's happening in the background is, there's a kind of a demographic trend in the sense that there's many more Indian youth finishing high school, and they need to go somewhere, right? And there's like that. If you think of the demographic, like the Indian youth population peaked in terms of numbers, right? It's a huge number of youth, right? And they're finishing high school, right? The government is pushing them through high school. Sometimes not very good schools in the sense, the education system at lower levels has major problems, including teacher absenteeism and so on. So they're not very well prepared for kind of the college, infrastructure. Of course, the students are very hardworking, right? They're studying late into the night. I've taught students in many parts of the world. Like, trust me, I've not met hardworking students like I've met in India, right? Like it's I mean, even like I studied, I did so many degrees. I have a PhD and all, but the amount I studied for my Indian board exams, I've never studied like that at any other point of time, right? Like, because we just work hard. But the education system in some ways has a lot of problems in India, right? It tries at many levels to be good, but like there are just too many problems, right? And especially in many parts of rural India, teachers just don't show up to class, for instance. So that's just a major problem that we need to fix, right? But on the higher education side, right, you have the IITs, you have the National Institutes of Importance, you have some good, the JNTUs and all, but then suddenly there's kind of this drop off. Then you have these private degree mills at some point, and that's like those are not great, right? So you need like much more kind of quality control in making sure that we get, the tail end of the universities are actually producing skills in many ways. Yeah.
Now that you mention it, I do feel like I think Indian education kind of not drops off, right? I think even in terms of status wise, I feel like UG gets the highest status, like in the sense,
Right.
like if you do your UG in any of the premier colleges, you brag about it, but almost nobody cares about like a master's, at least in terms of status as well. And even in terms of people knowing about colleges in India, I don't even know if there are like great, master's programs in India, but also PhD programs. Again, they even there you see
Yeah.
one is either mainstream don't really care about it, and even if they do, it's almost always like a better idea to either do it in some other country.
Yeah.
That infra is not even built, I feel.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And this is even true in the IITs in the sense that the IITs are good at training engineers, but not really creating kind of researchers, right? And so China has taken a different path in the sense that they not just want to create the engineers, but they want to create the researchers as well, right? For instance, they encourage publishing, patenting, so on and so forth. And in some ways, when you come to the forefront of the tech boom, so like now with the AI boom, suddenly China has leapfrogged India, right? Everyone, when the tech boom was starting off, it was like, oh, this is an opportunity for India, but China did it, right? And part of it is kind of the China was creating scientists while India was creating engineers, right? And so when you create scientists, then you can basically kind of use the forefront of the knowledge to really kind of develop the new technology in some ways, right? Like China is patenting in AI, creating kind of, I don't know, DeepSeek and all of these other things, right? And building data centers at a massive scale that India is not doing, for instance, right? So it's a different kind of education model in which the Indians are very good at, solving the problem. You give them a task and they'll solve the problem, right? But then we need kind of the high level kind of training to be able to develop new technology from kind of scratch. And of course, there are many innovative AI startups in India, startups in India as well, but it should be at a bigger scale in some ways, right?
Yeah, even here I see like two threads which I'm not able to reconcile. Like I think my understanding would be that I think a lot of the Indian startups that were started and which have done well, I think primarily they are either being started by graduates from IIT, and even BITS. There's a college
Yeah.
called BITS which also has a very
Yeah.
dominant presence in the startup ecosystem.
Yeah.
But like you mentioned, not too much. Like if comparing, there has been no deep seek movement in India, right? But also, if I can contrast this to China, IITs, there are plenty of them. At least I don't know, a couple, maybe 5 to 10, which are Delhi, Bombay, Madras, and a couple of things. And then we also have the NITs, like you mentioned.
Yeah.
China, if I'm not wrong, again, I don't know much about China, but the two universities that come to my mind are one is, I think, Tsinghua, and then there's Peking. But even with those two premier, even if they don't have like a chain of like very engineering colleges, they've still done extremely well on the business front and even on the science front, I feel.
Yeah. So what happened in China was basically it all changed the last 25 years, to be honest. So in the late 1990s, the Chinese government basically said, we need to invest massively in the higher education system, right? So the number of, the cohorts that were graduating, it was used to be like 1 million Chinese a year. It went to 9 million in a few years. So that's a massive growth. You've never seen anything like that in the history of the world, right? Like the kind of expansion that they did. And they pumped in a lot of money. They attracted Chinese researchers in the US at top universities to come back to China, saying that here we'll throw money at you to come, so it's essentially what Nehru had thought he was doing in the 60s, the Chinese government did in the early 2000s, right? And that is now paying off, right? And it paid off with kind of also with the EV boom, with the solar panel boom. now with the AI boom, right? Or China kind of has been on the forefront on all of this kind of technology, right? The green technology, but now with the AI stuff as well, right? And they just massively invest in that higher education system, right? So, and India has not seen anything like that, right? I mean, part of it is we don't have that kind of money, like you said. Like China is a lot richer. People keep putting India and China on the same page, but just look at the GDP per capita, guys. It's like it is a lot richer, So yeah. But part of the reason is, I think this is a very interesting history, right? So Raghuram Rajan, our former
Ex-RBI
RBI governor,
governor.
right? He talks a lot about how India doesn't need a manufacturing boom. India got this service sector led boom, right? And he was like, it's fine. We missed the manufacturing. He's written a new book, which is a great book. Everyone should take a look at it. It's fine that we skip the manufacturing bus. Like it's because we'll get this IT services boom, right? The problem is that the IT services boom, we think it's great. A lot of people have benefited from it, but it is very like urban, English speaking, upper middle class. It's concentrated in a certain segment of Indian society. It's not a widespread boom, right? It doesn't, the Chinese manufacturing boom, what it did was it lifted the entire country out of poverty, right? And so it kind of lifted people across the entire distribution, right? Made them richer. And then those are the kids that are going to college. They are the ones getting new skills, right? They are the ones, so India's enrollment ratios are still like 30-40%, only 30% of the youth are going to college, right? But in China, it's a lot higher because they're richer, right? And that because they had that manufacturing boom. And what's happening now is that with AI, we were all so happy that India had this IT service sector boom. With AI, that's under threat, right? Like we were talking about, the AI is cheaper, right? Can code, can handle all the language barrier stuff, right? And suddenly we don't have a manufacturing sector, and our service sector is under threat, right? So I do think history has played an important role here, and it's going to matter going forward. So I think India has to figure out how to innovate on the AI front, today, basically.
I think the total number of IT professionals cumulatively in India, I think it should be less than 10 million, if I'm not wrong. And I think I'm not.
Yeah,
It's a very low job creator,
yeah,
essentially.
yeah, yeah,
Services.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So it is a concentrated boom. Now, it's true that if you look at national statistics, it was the fastest growing sector in the country. It drove the Indian export boom in the 2000s, right? Like Indian exports were going up. If you look into the data, why were they going up? It was IT services. So it was increasing national income, right? But the benefits were concentrated. It's not helping poor farmers and things like that, right? So it's like it is a concentrated boom in that way, and as a result, you don't have that same kind of the next generation all going to college and so on and so forth, right? So in some ways it matters, right, that we don't have that fully skilled workforce that's broad based in some ways.